Welcome, everyone. This is a Young Voices forum for Caleb Franz's new book, The Conductor, the story of Reverend John Rankin. Young Voices forums are kind of a not usually planned, but usually about quarterly event we host where we bring in either friends of the organization who have books coming out, or folks in our network as well, who have something to talk about, some sort of project. And we are very excited that today, I think this is the first time we're actually hosting a Young Voices forum with somebody currently on staff, and that is Mr. Caleb Franz. So it's very exciting. He has a book coming out that is being distributed by Simon & Schuster, called The Conductor, the story of Reverend John Rankin, abolitionism's essential founding father. So we're going to jump into it. I got a number of questions for Caleb. We'll have plenty of time, at least 20 or 30 minutes for Q&A. So just a few housekeeping notes. Please keep yourself muted unless you're talking during the Q&A. We can take live questions, or we could also take questions from the chat. So we encourage the use of the chat box to jot down your thoughts, your questions, interact with other folks in the chat box. I will read out your questions when it comes to that. But with that, I will now jump in to introducing Caleb. So Caleb Franz has built a career as a writer, podcaster, and nonprofit professional. He often provides commentary on public affairs and writes on American history. His work has appeared in outlets such as The Independent, The Washington Examiner, RealClearHistory, and more. He currently resides in Lexington, Kentucky with his wife, Danielle. And of course, he is our program manager here at Young Voices, where he manages so many writers in this room, our contributor program, making sure that it goes smoothly, and works with just lots of inspiring voices for liberty. And we're excited too that he is now a voice for liberty with a book coming out on, is it October 15th, Caleb?
Yes, October 15th.
Fabulous. So we'll make sure to follow up with all the relevant links after the talk. But Caleb, we are so glad to have you here.
Well, thank you so much. I think this is a really interesting and important story that for the most part has largely been lost to history. So being able to bring the story forward in this capacity is quite the honor, and I'm happy to be able to share it with you all today.
Yeah, so let's jump into it. Obviously, we're kind of assuming everyone knows about the Civil War, knows about abolitionism, the slave trade here, but and maybe I've heard of other abolitionist speakers like John Brown, Harriet Beecher Stowe, etc. But Reverend John Rankin, he's kind of a slightly more obscure figure in history, at least today. Most Americans would probably not know who Reverend John Rankin is. So tell us, who is he, and what inspired you to write about him?
Yeah, so Reverend John Rankin, for all intents and purposes, and something that I kind of discovered throughout the process of writing this book, is that he really is the father of abolitionism as we understand it in the historical context of the American anti-slavery movement. That's not to say that he is the first to ever conceive of the idea of abolitionism or immediate abolitionism. It's not to say that he was the first to promote it or anything like that. Of course, there were several people stretching all the way back to the founding and even before that, who believed in some kind of idea of emancipation or gradual emancipation, something along those lines. But what John Rankin did was he put together sort of the arguments surrounding immediate emancipation, the idea that if a slave has a right to freedom, then they don't have the right to freedom in 20 or 30 years, the way that some people were proposing at the time, but rather they have a right to freedom today. And he put these arguments together because his brother Thomas had recently let him know that he had purchased slaves himself, and this kind of felt like a sense of betrayal almost to him, because they all grew up in Eastern Tennessee, in Dandridge, Tennessee, in a very like abolitionist household, a community that, while obviously in the South slavery was present, but in Eastern Tennessee there was a lot of anti-slavery sentiments that were popping up around the time, and Rankin was a result of that. So he felt like this was not just a betrayal of the sensibilities that he was raised in, but also a betrayal of, to some extent, of his own family. And he believed that if his own brother, his own flesh and blood, could fall for these arguments, then the rest of the country, the rest of his community, certainly had no filter, no guard against that. So what he did was he conceded with every possible notion of a pro-slavery argument, and he offered a rebuttal to it. And he put these in the local paper instead of directly mailing them to him. He mailed him the local paper in Ripley, Ohio, which is where he lived for most of his life, and sent him that. And that was so that way more people can kind of jump on to these ideas. And as these letters started to circulate and as they started to popularize, they became something akin to the Federalist Papers for the abolition movement, making the case for immediate emancipation for everyone to be able to read.
So let's contrast Rankin with some of the other kind of key figures of abolitionism today, or that were kind of more famous, like William Lloyd Garrison or Harrison Beecher Stowe. What kind of differentiated him from it? Is it exactly that point that slaves have the right to freedom today, or is there more depth to it?
There is a little bit more depth to it. Uh, those two individuals in particular, Garrison and Harry Beecher Stowe, both knew Rankin and took inspiration from him himself. Garrison points back to Rankin as the figure who he considers to be his anti-slavery father. In fact, it was those letters that kind of fell into his lap a few years after they were published that Garrison says is the cause of his entry into the anti-slavery movement. So he had a long relationship with Rankin. Sometimes butting heads with him on a few different things. Garrison was a bit more radical in his approach, whereas Rankin believed in, this is the constant debate between like purity and pragmatism. Rankin was someone who believed in the purity of the ideas and did not really compromise on those morals, but also believed that you have to be strategic about the way that you approach various things, whereas Garrison was a little bit more bombastic in his approach, to the point to where he is quite literally setting the Constitution on fire in a copy of the Constitution on fire on the 4th of July in the 1850s. So that's not something that Rankin would ever really participate in. Stowe, on the other hand, she knew Rankin and was good friends with him. Of course, living in Cincinnati, not too far from Ripley, Ohio. And Stowe's approach was more raw storytelling, as opposed to the intellectual affront that Rankin took, but also his activities on the Underground Railroad directly impacted and influenced Stowe's storytelling abilities. And she took many of his stories and incorporated it into what is obviously her most popular work in Uncle Tom's Cabin. So you have a direct impact from that, from John Rankin to Harry Beecher Stowe.
Yeah, were there any others that he really influenced? Like, how did his work and leadership influence the broader anti-slavery movement at the time?
Yeah, well, he was there right at the beginning of the formation of the anti-slavery movement. Of course, Garrison took inspiration from that, and then they kind of worked together in building up the American anti-slavery movement once after the Liberator was published, and then the formation of that society. And a lot of what the abolitionists were trying to do at the time, they were trying to create state surrogates where they could prop this up, and he was very instrumental in making sure that happened in Ohio. And then also there's a few other figures that, some people might be surprised to hear, such as Ulysses S. Grant, for example, is one of my favorite figures that he influenced, where he was a school teacher and he went to Rankin School in Ripley, Ohio before going on to West Point. This was the school that he went before going on to West Point. So several figures here that has some tremendous influence. But Rankin's role throughout the entire movement from the beginning to the end was I compare him something to like a George Washington type figure. Martin Luther King might be another comparable example. But if you're familiar with George Washington's role in American history, and specifically at his point in the formation of the Republic, he was kind of the center of gravity, this anchor, where all these other founders were kind of splintering off into various factions. Washington's sort of gravitas and his example that he led by brought them all together so that way the country didn't split apart. Well, Rankin was very much in a similar role in that capacity, but rather than the entire country, he played that role with the anti-slavery movement itself.
Could you share a particularly dramatic or moving moment from Rankin's life that you feel encapsulates his character and dedication to the cause of abolishing slavery?
Yeah, there are so many in the book that, and so many throughout his story, that it's tough to pick just one. Um, However, I think that there's one instance that I think is particularly dramatic and kind of demonstrates his commitment to this entire cause. Was throughout the 1830s, when he was most active. He made a lot of enemies, and a lot of people were very unhappy about his commitment to this and kind of bringing abolition to their attention. Not always necessarily because that they supported slavery, but some people, they did not like that you were having fugitives and slave catchers kind of meeting in their communities and creating this tension of violence, and they were very unhappy about the abolitionists and their view bringing these communities together and kind of threatening their livelihoods and their families. And Rankin was at the forefront of that. And throughout the 1830s, he had mobs form around him. He had eggs pelted. At one point, he had to start parking his horse on the other side of town, so that way they didn't shear it and bob its tail. So you have a lot of increase in violence around this time, and it started to culminate really with bounties that were being placed on his head, to the point to where in 1841, there was a siege that took place on his house. Several pro-slavery proponents and assassins all kind of sort of culminated onto his house in September of 1841. And there was this massive shootout that led eventually to the rest of the community in Ripley, the rest of the conductors in Ripley, converging onto the house to protect the Rankins. Now, fortunately, none of the family or anything like that was hurt. There was a couple of the assassins that were injured in the shootout, but he picked up his pen the next day and wrote a warning in the paper saying, I see it as much of my duty to shoot any would-be midnight assassins as it is my duty to pray. And I think that that is being, given that he's a minister, a Presbyterian minister, and I think that really kind of encompasses his commitment to the cause, and that he's not going to stand down just at the face of intimidation.
So let's talk about the Underground Railroad. This is something that is often romanticized and misunderstood. I think a good percentage of Americans think that the Underground Railroad was a literal railroad today. How does your book kind of handle the realities and the dangers of the time of abolitionists who were working in the Underground Railroad, and how does kind of the realities of being an abolitionist differ from the romanticization that you see today?
Yeah, well, I think the story that I just alluded to is one example of that. I think one of the great tragedies of the Underground Railroad, or of the I should say the not the Underground Railroad, but rather um, the nature of freedom and slavery at the time, and in this antebellum era, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. One of the great tragedies of this is that so much of the history around this has been lost. Nobody truly knows the full history of the Underground Railroad. And that was because after 1850, especially, so many of the conductors, you had people recording the stories of the fugitives that would go through their stations, and wanting to keep their stories alive. You have, I think William Still is probably the greatest example of this, an abolitionist out of Philadelphia, who collected all these stories and published it in a book entitled The Underground Railroad. This happened in Ripley as well. But after 1850, a lot of the conductors were either instructed by people like Rankin, or took it upon themselves to burn any collection of stories or resources, so that way nothing would either come back to them and expose the greater line of the Underground Railroad that would shoot all the way up to Canada, and to protect the fugitives that were on the run, trying to escape to Canada. So this is kind of an example of something that, even though this happened over 150 plus years ago, it still very much affects us because we don't know the full story, and we never will, because a lot of these stories will be lost. So the best thing that we can do is just to try to collect as much of this as possible, and try to communicate it in a way that's best we can.
So when it came to your original research with Rankin and his role in the Underground Railroad, I mean, do you have any rough estimates of how many slaves he saved, or just broadly, like, is there anything new you brought to the discourse, the historical record about Rankin's role in freeing slaves?
Yeah, so he had over it's estimated that he had over 2,000 fugitives pass through his station on the way to Canada. This is by and far one of the most active stations on the entire Underground Railroad. And it took place. I think what's really interesting about this is because a lot of abolitionist history takes place either in New England, or we see a lot of stuff that's recorded on the East Coast, or around Maryland or Virginia, or various places like that. But this was on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains, that I think kind of gets under reported, and the stories around that area are kind of undertold, in a popular sense. So a lot of the history that I uncovered, fortunately, Rankin was a pretty prolific writer, so he wrote a lot in papers, newspapers, a lot of editorials that I was able to rely on. He did also produce an autobiography whenever he was 80. this was after the Civil War, so he was able to kind of tell as much of the story there as possible. His son did as well, his firstborn son did. So a lot of those stories I was able to pull from those resources. But like I said, there's still so much history, even in this story, let alone, all the other stories that were prevalent at the time, that is just lost. But a lot of the new information in this story really comes around his time in the Civil War, which had been surprising to me, probably the most reported element of his story. But he was very active. He was older, so less active during the Civil War than he was in the 1830s. But he still picked up his pen, and he still would write sort of the cause of the Civil War, and he would have instances throughout each year, saying that the Civil War needs to be waged against slavery, and the bullets that are flying need to actually result in fugitive slaves, or slaves still trapped behind enemy lines, so to speak, in the South. It needs to result in total abolition. Otherwise, we're just going to be back where we started in another generation.
Okay, so let's move the discussion to today. What lessons from Rankin's life and work do you think are the most relevant to today's discussions, especially when it comes to social justice activism, pushing for a more equitable and just world? What lessons can be learned, particularly about tactics?
Um, there's two things that come to mind. Well, the first thing is, especially in reference to kind of our broader conversation around um, race and justice, and all of the sort of buzzwords that are frequent to pop into the lexicon of our current discussion around these issues. Uh, Rankin always emphasized, despite the fact that he was very absolute in his approach to immediate emancipation, he always also emphasized the need for reconciliation and the need for restoration, which is very different from, I mean, even some of the abolitionists in his day. And I think you kind of see this in today as well, the emphasis of payback or vengeance. He was just as concerned about the soul, the spiritual state of the slaveholders, and what slavery does to them, just as much as the physical well-being, as well as the spiritual state of the people that they enslaved. And that, I think, is something that gets overlooked or underemphasized as much, is because he looking at it from a Christian perspective that he did. He looked at all humanity as his brethren, and he abhorred violence. He tried to put off the Civil War as long as possible, even whenever he kind of looked at it as somewhat inevitable. By the late 1850s, he was still trying to ensure that slavery could meet its demise peacefully rather than through violence and bloodshed. And I think that is a key component that needs to be remembered about the conversations about race and justice that we have today. On the activism front, I think that there are a lot of lessons that anyone in libertarian or conservative circles, or really any circles where you have a big push of infighting, where people have kind of different approaches about pragmatism versus purity. I think Rankin's story really kind of emphasizes the proper balance of that, and how to approach the different infighting that can happen in a social movement like that.
Great, fabulous. I have one last question, which is kind of related more to publishing for any of our aspiring writers here, but I think I'm going to save that one for last. And instead, since we're focusing on Rankin's life, to tackle some of the questions from the audience there. So if you have more questions, please type them in the chat box or raise your hand and I can call you on you live. But first, I will turn the first question over to Aaron Andrews, who asks, why is it important for Rankin's story to be told today? Is it relevant to current events at all? Kind of similar to my last question, but
yeah,
more about.
I do think it is relevant. I think Rankin's story, the way that I kind of approached this when I wrote the book is I kind of realized that this was an important story to tell now, because like Rankin, the current political environment is very divisive. It is not to the point to where, you know, he has mobs and assassins following him. But it's increasingly getting to that point. And you know, even in the recent assassination attempts and various things like that, we are kind of getting closer to that area than we really should. And I think a lot of our discussions about where we are as a country and what America is and what it represents ultimately stems from a breakdown of communication, and a sort of two different histories that are being told about the United States, that oftentimes can be misconstrued, or not view the full picture. And I viewed Rankin as this bridge figure between the America of the founders and the America of the 13th Amendment. And I think that too often we overlook that era of American history, which provides key context and key details, not just in our political discussions, but also in our conversations around race and slavery and what it means to be an American in the first place. So I think that in that context, Rankin is incredibly timely, because he is the figure that can kind of bridge the divide between the two Americas that we see ourselves in today.
I kind of have a follow-up off of that, Caleb. You mentioned that miscommunication is one of the biggest problems that we face today in this age of political polarization. What can we learn from Rankin's story about how to enact change on important issues?
That's that the enemy, you'll notice in this book, there's not necessarily an antagonist. There are a few like antagonizing figures. Of course, he had bounties on his head. There's one figure in particular which kind of almost helps expose the Underground Railroad, named William Greathouse, who plays a rather dramatic role. But there is no singular villain, so to speak. And that I think is very intentional, because Rankin never really looked at his fellow man as enemies or villains. He looked at slavery itself as the villain, and slavery itself in this book is the antagonist. And I think that is insightful in the way that we should be looking at things. Of course, there's the old Lincoln quote about how I take away my enemies by making them my friends, paraphrasing. So I think that approach is a difficult one, and not one that is very conducive to the current political environment, but it is one that I think has a proven track record and will ultimately help things. Yeah.
Great. Aaron Castillo White asks, Rankin was a prolific writer whose work was widely regarded in his lifetime. Has his writing held up? Is it something people should continue to read either in American history classes or in general?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that his insights are on slavery itself is very you can see how much ahead of his time he is whenever he's discussing the issues of slavery. I think everyone should read his letters on American slavery, especially because he was a Southerner. He came from Eastern Tennessee. He lived in Kentucky for several years, and then he only really went to he only really escaped slavery or escaped the South as far as he needed to. So he was right there on the line of the Ohio and Kentucky border, right there on the Ohio River. And I think that's very telling because he had certain insights and he knew how to communicate to Southerners in a way that a lot of the Northern abolitionists, either in the Western Reserve in Ohio or in New England, a lot of them often missed. Abolitionism was kind of looked at as New England fanaticism by a lot of people in the South at the time. And Rankin was able to communicate this in a way that a more southern audience could actually understand and comprehend. Not without stirring some controversy, but certainly in a way that didn't necessarily offend their sensibilities in the way that some of the New Englanders did.
You kind of touched upon.
Yeah, sorry, can I jump in, Casey? This is
Sure.
The question that I asked actually goes right into this. Why didn't he stay in Tennessee if he had this great way of communicating with Southerners in a way that would like communicate abolition to them in like sensible, in like words they can understand? Why the move to Ripley?
Well, I think it sort of demonstrates the influence that that slavery had on the South, and so that's not a whole lot of abolitionists. Many abolitionists who are from the South eventually, most of them moved to the North. They may have moved to Ohio, or they may have moved all the way to New England, but they did end up moving. Part of the reason was for safety, for practical purposes, so they wouldn't get killed. But also, you know, Rankin wanted to be able to preach whenever he was first getting into the ministry in Eastern Tennessee. He led a sermon preaching against all forms of oppression, and he didn't outright identify slavery, but enough elders in the church kind of could read between the lines and more or less told him that, like, you can preach against slavery or you could preach here, but you can't do both. So he took that as his cue that he needed to leave slavery's influence. And he did almost stay around in Kentucky. Actually, he quite liked he quite liked Kentucky a lot, and he had no intention of staying as long as he did. He ended up staying for 4 years, but again, once he started to try to preach to slaves in the region, that was whenever slaveholders started to pop their heads up again and say, you're gonna have to leave. You can't do this here. So he did try to find as many excuses as he could to remain where he was. And he loved the people and he loved the culture, but he couldn't coexist with slavery.
Great. Next. Nate Phillips asks, were there any aspects of Rankin's life, character, and legacy that you found difficult to capture?
That's a good question. I don't know if it was difficult to capture, but you know, there always kind of runs a threat or a risk among anyone who's trying to dip their toes into history about either romanticizing them as a person, especially if you particularly like your subject matter. It can become really easy to kind of gloss over their flaws. And that was something that I didn't really want to do, but I also one of the real annoyances I have about American history today is that it's overtly critical in a way that lacks nuance. And I didn't want to go in that direction either. And I think one instance in particular where he walks out. This was after the attack on his house, so he's a little bit more on edge, a little bit more trigger happy, for lack of a better lack of a better term. He walks out on his house one morning and looks across the river and sees that there were a handful of fugitives that missed the rendezvous point. And the sun was rising, and the entirety of Ripley and everywhere else, including any slave catchers who were trying to see where anyone would be waiting, would be able to see them. And he was prepared to basically invade Kentucky to go capture them and march them straight up to his house and wait till nightfall. If he did this, this would have been, I mean, near suicide for the Underground Railroad in Ripley, as well as for the fugitive slaves that he was trying to protect. It shows that even someone like him can have kind of a weak moment, or have a moment where anger or frustration or something like that can really get the best of them. And I did want to make sure that I captured those moments in Rankin's life as well, because he didn't always make the right step or right decision, but he always had the right inclination about the direction that he was going. And even whenever he did make those wrong steps, he had such a conviction or such an integrity about himself that he was able to take a step back and sort of instantly recognize whenever he needed to reassess the situation.
Matt Cookson asks, during the Civil War, did Rankin have any connections either in Congress or at the White House that served as allies for his cause?
That's another good question. At this point in his story, he was around his 70s. So he never, he remained in Ripley for most of his life. So he wasn't connected too much in that sense politically. I think he purposefully avoided, I mean, this is just my personal speculation on this, but I think he purposely avoided politics for the most part. However, he, of course, knew plenty of abolitionists who did. And anytime he would write, or anytime that he would kind of put his opinions out there and make them known, it carried weight, even if he didn't directly lobby Congress, or so to speak. But he never had the opportunity to meet someone like Abraham Lincoln, for example. Like I mentioned, he did know Grant, and after the war, he did visit Washington, D.C. He met with the Speaker of the House. He met with Grant in the White House, but during the war, he did not. He stayed in Ripley.
Great. Fun question. Jason Reed, if Rankin were alive and politically active today, what would he campaign for?
That's a good question. What issue would he be active in? Is that more along the lines of what you're asking, Jason?
Jason says
Okay.
yes.
I think that he would be still fairly active on social issues. I think that he, of course, would look at racial issues and take that into consideration. But I think it's also kind of a mistake to assume that the way that there's kind of an attitude in the historical community, if not outright, then kind of implied, that a lot of the abolitionists would be leftists today. And that, I think, is just not good history. Some of them would have been, certainly. Some of them probably would have been socialists, certainly. But I think a lot of people, including Rankin, would be a little bit more in the lines of conservative in their political thinking. Him, Frederick Douglass, not to say that Frederick Douglass would like anything happening with the right today either, but all of that kind of wing of the abolitionists very much believed in the integrity of the Constitution, and wielding that as an anti-slavery document or a pro-liberty document. And I think that carries on to a lot of conservative thought today. So it's kind of hard to anticipate what he would specifically be active on. I think honestly, he would probably just stick to preaching if he were alive today, since the great kind of cause of his life had been accomplished. And he would stick to kind of social ills of society, like moral ills, cultural activities. But I think he would mostly stick to preaching today if he were alive today.
Great. Isaac Willer asks, major theme of the book is Rankin's struggle to organize the abolitionist movement and sort out inter-movement differences. WLG being the main example. I'm not sure what that means. Maybe Caleb can explain.
Yeah.
Yes. What lessons does this hold for the modern right?
Well, I think the abolitionists were very eager to splinter. For context, Garrison was someone who believed in no union with slaveholders, was the slogan that they tried to advance, and many of the Garrisonians wholeheartedly endorsed that. They were kind of pushing for secession in many ways. And that is something that Rankin did not believe in, and neither did many of his followers and his colleagues. And I think that the approach of Rankin to kind of bring unity to, like, immediate abolitionism is the cause. We cannot accept schemes like colonization, or we cannot accept schemes like gradual emancipation. However, wherever we can do something practically where it's not going to undercut our own mission, which is, I think, what a lot of Garrison and his followers kind of fell into the traps of. That was something that Rankin was very quick to emphasize. He did not want the good to become the enemy of the great, but he also wanted to ensure that the good indeed was good. And I think that balance was something that conservatives, libertarians, whatever social group or whatever political movement that there is, can really take a lot of value and inspiration from that.
Great. This is the last call for questions. If anyone wants to, maybe at this point, just use the raise hand function or just unmute yourself. We'll give about 15 seconds here. If not, I have my final question. Okay, in that case, oh, wait, Norman Horn has his hand raised. Norm, go for it.
Hey, Caleb, good to see you here, and so proud of what you've accomplished with this book, of course. Just curious, you've done all this work on Rankin. What's next for you? Are you continuing to write about kind of continuing on with this study of abolitionism, or do you think you're going to be moving on to something else next?
That's a question I've asked myself for the past 2 years. I do have an idea about what the next story is going to be. I'm working on that proposal or that outline currently. It will probably kind of stay in the vein of abolitionists near Appalachia, or near the Ohio River Valley. I think that there's so much story here that has been largely untouched or uncovered, and so much of the story of the abolitionists broadly is still kind of untouched or uncovered. So I'm very interested in bringing that story to life. But yeah, I'll have more updates on that soon. But I am actively working on that.
Awesome. Well, as a minor comment, we talked a little bit at Freedom Fest about your work, and I think about David Lipscomb and some other things there. I'd love to continue those conversations. We definitely appreciate you at LCI, Libertarian Christian Institute, guys, and of course, we want to bring you on to do some podcasts and whatnot. So I don't mean to take over a conversation, but I just want you to know we appreciate you, and you and others here are always welcome over at our place. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, that'd be great, Norm. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you, Norman. Sarah also comments, Caleb, don't forget to bask in the glory first before writing another book. Victoria, I see your hand is raised. You want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I think we've had some similar questions to what I'm looking to ask, but kind of when you were planning to write this book, you talked about right now how it's timely to kind of some of the political climate that we have, but obviously writing a book is a process that takes, over a year, sometimes 2 or more years. So how do you make sure when you propose a book in whatever context or climate that you're in, it's going to be relevant by the time that you publish it?
That's a very good question. The answer is that it's a bit of a gamble. You don't fully know what the context or the climate is going to be like, but you do have to trust a little bit that whatever you're writing about is going to be timely enough for, 2 or 3 years from now, whenever the book actually comes out. Whenever I put together the proposal, it was kind of in the wake of a lot of the riots that were happening, a lot of the BLM riots, and that was very kind of front of mind as far as like, well, what's the disconnect? Where are people? Why do we have such strong division over the history of this country, especially as it related to like statues coming down and various things like that? Clearly, we're talking past each other, and I wanted to kind of find this figure that could help us bridge that gap. And that's not quite the same situation that we're in today, but there's still plenty of material with the division and political violence that we see today. It was a real easy shift to go from what I had proposed in my proposal to now we're 2 weeks out from the release date, and it's still very relevant and it's still very timely. And I think part of the approach needs to just kind of be an awareness that you're not hooking yourself to something that's too time sensitive, because those kind of books will, especially we all know about like election oriented books or something like that, where it has a shelf life for like 6 months or something like that. Rankin's story, regardless of what year it is, will always have some kind of relevance to it. And that's part of the journey. That's part of the process of discovery, is to see how is it going to be relevant in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
Great. Well, that seems like a good transition to the question I was going to ask, which is just broadly, can you tell us about the process of, conceiving of this book idea, putting together a proposal, pitching it, getting a deal, and just broadly, what advice would you give to people who are thinking or aspiring to write a book?
When I started putting this idea together, I knew that I wanted to kind of build a career in telling history and telling stories around around figures and just stories that I gravitated towards and that I loved. And there is kind of an art to the approach for that. But what I was starting to do was a little bit more geared toward stories that may have already been told before. And whenever I had read The Pioneers by David McCullough, I kind of had this light bulb moment, which is a great book. It's one of my favorites. I had this light bulb moment about there's all this history that takes place in this case, literally in my backyard. Rankin died in the town that I grew up in Ironton, Ohio. And I recognized that, and the more that I dug into this, the more that I realized that his story has largely been untouched since he was alive, with a few exceptions here and there, but for the most part, has largely been untouched. And those are the stories that people are craving for. And those are the stories that people want to hear and that they need to hear, and they want to feel connected to this bigger American story in their own backyard, because so much of the way that we tell our history is through the lens of either Washington, D.C. or Boston or Philadelphia or various places like that. All important stories, but there's so much more to it than just that provides key context. And Rankin's story is one of those things. So I kind of discovered that that's a story that I can tell that no one else is going to be able to tell. And if you can identify that, what that story looks like, where you're uniquely qualified, regardless of what your background is, or regardless of what your qualifications or credentials are, if you're able to say, like, this is the story and I'm able to tell it, and I'm in the position to be able to tell it, that's going to catch any publisher's eye. And it might go through a couple of rounds before you finally land on the right publisher for it. But have faith in your story and your product, and that is something that largely can work out. And also be flexible with it. The story of John Rankin was not necessarily the first thing that I proposed. I had proposed a broader story about the history of the abolition movement along the Ohio River. But Rankin was, whenever I was having conversations with my publisher, Rankin was the figure that really stood out in that story. And we both kind of agreed that his deserves kind of a biography of its own. So we gravitated towards that. And so it is important to also not be totally anchored to the proposal that you put forward, but anchored enough to where you can advocate for it.
Awesome. Well, we will leave it there, Caleb. Really appreciate your time today. This was an excellent discussion. I dropped a link to Caleb's book, the Simon & Schuster landing page, in the chat here. It's available for pre-order now, released on October 15th. We will also be throwing a book party for Caleb on October 22nd in Washington, D.C., at Mission DuPont, where we will be giving out free copies of the book. So if any of you live around DC or will be visiting, please come to the party and get your free book. I have also put the link to Young Voices' upcoming events, not just for that one, but also some upcoming events in the future. We're throwing 2 debates this month in October in New York City, with our new debate series called Young Voices Next Gen. It will also be recorded and streaming on the platform Civil. So for those of you not in attendance, we'll make sure to record the whole thing. And of course, got Caleb's book party and plenty of other events coming in the fall in DC as well. So we hope to see you in person, not just online, hopefully for those of you located on the East Coast. And if not, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate Caleb's time, and pre-order the book. We'll have more Young Voices Forum events in the future. Thanks for joining us all today, folks. Have a great one. And congratulations, Caleb.
Thanks, guys.
Ooh. Cheers.